All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the structure for the research paper, as far as like kind of some ideas of how to outline it and start to think about um, things as you start, putting more research together, kind of finalizing your sources and really thinking about the arguments that you're going to be building. So as far as work for this week, let me just share my screen really quick. Um, the only thing that's technically due is turning in the second source report, right? So for week 16, our second source report, we go to student view really quick. Second source report is going to be due, and that's the only other source report that we have to do. Is just two of them. So what I want to spend most of our time talking about, the second source report, I'll just scoot over to it really quick, is going to look just like the first one. As far as, what's going to be turned in, how you're going to turn it in, all that good stuff, right? It's going to be due on Sunday. And then here's a quick little kind of like, again, same little overview, exactly what you did for the first source report. Like, what is the problem that you're researching? What is the source? Put an MLA citation, give a summary of the source, how you're planning on using in your essay, and how is this source a reliable source of the topic that you're researching, right? So just exact same assignment that you did for the first one. Just kind of gives me a chance to see another source you're using, and it also gets you to really think about how you're going to be utilizing this source in your essay. And the first ones that people turned in look really strong, right? Like, I mean, they're doing exactly what needs to be done. So if you have any questions when you're finding the second source, if you're having a harder time or something like that, let me know, and we can start digging around and looking for some different examples.
Yeah, same goes for me. I'm happy to help out with that stuff. I honestly kind of love digging around and looking for stuff on the databases. So don't hesitate to ask me to help out.
So then let's look at research paper structure. So this is in this week's module, and I'm just going to kind of give a little bit of overview of what you're doing for this paper and kind of think about how to structure it. As far as like making, a rough outline, if that's helpful for you, right? To kind of think about what are the major points or ideas that you want to hit along the way as you're writing this paper. And so one of the things that can be really helpful is to kind of break down the individual components of this paper, right? Your introduction, your body paragraphs, your conclusion. And it's still making the same moves that we made in other papers throughout the semester. It's just that these ones are bigger, right? But there's more to write about. And so, instead of having one small paragraph for your introduction or a half a page for your introduction, your intro for this research paper could be a page and a half, 2 pages, even something like that, right? To kind of really make sure that you're kind of hitting all of these things along the way. So let's talk about the introduction a little bit. So your introduction is really important that you're building context for your reader. That this is one of those things that we want to make sure that, like we talked about in the past, like your reader is not, you want to assume that your reader doesn't have the same expertise you do on the things that you're writing about, right? You want to assume that your reader hasn't read the same things that you've read, that your reader's not familiar with the topics in the same way that you're familiar with them. And so in this case, this is going to be especially true when you're writing the research paper, because short of reading your research proposals and your source reports or meeting individually with you, I don't have the same expertise that you do. I don't even maybe have knowledge about the topic that you're researching if it's something that I'm an outsider of. So it's going to be really important to make sure that you're building that context. So one of the things that you want to do is that you're defining the community and the specific problem that affects members of the community. So when I say defining the community, definition of the community is really kind of breaking down who are the members of this community, maybe some specific details about this community. Maybe it's a specific demographic within this community, right? So it's like, maybe if you're researching, I don't know, homelessness in the Bay Area, maybe there's a specific element, because that's such a giant topic, right? Maybe there's a specific element of that community that you're looking at, and you want to kind of narrow that down a little bit. But the important thing is that you're writing for an outsider, right? You're writing for somebody who doesn't have that same experience or context that you have. And so that you have to make sure that you're not just kind of like skimming over this idea of who the community is. So maybe kind of thinking about the demographic, maybe think about describing it in some detail. And then also same thing with the problem. What is the specific problem that's affecting members of this community? So that you're making sure that you're giving plenty of context so that the reader has a clear understanding of those things. And that's really important because one, you want the reader, importantly to know who you're writing about or what community you're writing about, but also with strong description of the problem, the reader will see that this is a worthwhile problem that's worthy of attention, right? It's severe enough that there needs to be something done about it. And so when you get to that idea of like starting to show solutions, that can be really helpful. And again, you're writing for an outsider, right? Doesn't understand the problem, hasn't done the same research. You've got to build context for the reader in your introduction. So in your introduction, you don't need to go into the same level of detail that you will throughout your body paragraphs, right? That's what your body paragraphs are for. So you don't need to go into all the different examples in the research. You don't need to go into a specific details, about what causes the problem or things like that. You can hint at those a little bit, but you want to save those things for the body paragraphs, right? Think about that kind of maybe in the context of like a movie trailer, right? They don't want to give you every single detail of the movie in the movie trailer. Otherwise, there'd be no point in watching the movie. And sometimes there's really bad movie trailers that do that, where you're like, oh, yeah, I kind of know what this whole thing's going to be about, or they almost spoiled something in the movie, right? Think about what information does my reader need to be like, okay, I'm on board with this now, and now I can follow along with the ideas that I'm getting ready to present. So one of the things that can be really helpful to build context for your reader is to use the database Gale. Let me show you really quick what I'm talking about why I think Gale is really effective to help you build context in your research paper. So I'm just going to go up here to the library, and we'll look at Gale really quick. And you'll see why this database works very well for building context in the introduction. So Gale can be really helpful, right? Because Gale's going to bring up books, right? And this is one of those places where, using an introduction from a book, right, or as one of your sources can be a really helpful source, because typically what writers will do like early on in the introduction of their books is establish a context for an issue, right? That's the writer's job, is to make sure the reader is on board with the ideas, presenting a context for the reader with the ideas that you're going to be exploring. So one of the things that I would recommend is, if you're thinking about, needing an extra source or needing some sort of way to build context for your reader in your introduction, that you'd be able to use Gale potentially to be able to help you do that, right? So like that, one of the things you might do is in here, do a search for the topic that you're exploring. So for example, if I start to do a search in here for homelessness, right? It gives a quick little overview. So maybe like one of these ideas that I want to focus on specifically is maybe looking at families. Maybe that's the community I'm establishing, right? Maybe I'm not just going to look at, like we said, not just going to look at like homelessness in general, but maybe homelessness within families, right? Because maybe that's the community that I want to focus on a little bit more. But like right in here, I found this overview. And this can be really helpful because when I look at this source, oh, why am I getting an error here in this application? Unable to find resource. That's a great example then.
That happens though.
Yeah, I know it does. Let's see if it is a, yeah, it's both times. But let me just show you a source really quick. What's going on here? Maybe it's down for some reason, because now I'm seeing more than one. Yeah, huh. Well, this is kind of a bad time to give this example right now, but I would check in a little while, because maybe sometimes these databases can be down for a quick few, or they can be, like maintaining the website or something like that. So I would just double check here on Gale a little bit later, maybe later on today or something like that, and it might be back up. But you can see the reason that I wanted to show this source to you, it's just weird that it doesn't seem like I can click on them right now. It just keeps giving me these errors. I wonder if it's my browser too. And if I try a different browser, that might work. But here's what's really helpful about this is that it limits your search down a little bit. And then what it does is it gives you this overview of what's being talked about in this book, which will help establish context for the issue that you're exploring. So again, I think Gale is a really nice resource to be able to help you build context in your introduction. So just, if that sounds helpful for you, it's definitely something that you could use to help with that part of your intro. So you could strengthen the efficacy of your introduction by persuading your reader through, we talked about this idea like this ethos, pathos, and logos, right? Like if you establish the fact that there's a problem within a community, then maybe you start to appeal to your reader through showing some of the kind of calling into question people's ethics, right? Like about needing to do something because it's the right thing to do, or maybe appealing to some sort of emotions, right? If I'm giving some description of a family experiencing homelessness and what that looks like, and maybe kind of dispelling the idea that it's the same thing as somebody living on the street, but maybe it's somebody who is having to stay with relatives and find some different places to stay at different times throughout the week, that can be an example to maybe kind of appeal to people's emotions and then show that is a significant problem, right? Or maybe an appeal to logic, right? So kind of really thinking about your job is to convince this reader that there is a severe problem this community is facing. And so by using one of these rhetorical modes of persuasion, that can be really helpful to do that. And then finally, you want to make sure that your thesis or your prevailing question is somewhere in your intro. And I think it works really well to put this at the end. And remember, you could have either a thesis statement where you present the idea that there's a problem and that there needs to be some sort of solution that you're exploring to dive into, to think about what it is that needs to be done to address that problem, or to kind of fix that problem, or to maybe it's not 100% fix, but to alleviate some of that, the issues the communities face because of that problem. Or the other thing that you can do is think about maybe a prevailing question, right? And these prevailing questions are specific questions that we have about this issue, and then saying well, what is the best way to address this, right? And I think that's also an honest way to come about doing research, because when we're putting the intro together, right, maybe we have no idea. And maybe it's coming from that place of I don't know what to do to fix this, but I know something does need to be done, right? So if I'm thinking about, families experiencing homelessness in the Bay Area, I would maybe have a prevailing question there. I would say this is something that we see, driving across Highway 80. This is something that's regularly occurring, and it seems that the issue is getting more and more severe. It's something needs to be done, but what are the best ways to go about addressing this and helping people within this community?
A strong move I've seen students use in the past is when you're in a situation like that and there is no clear solution to this problem, a good way to think about that is maybe just knowing the problem is the first step to building towards a solution, of just that, and working that into your thesis of we need to understand what this is before we can really start building a solution for it.
Exactly. And I think that's totally okay in a research paper to come at it from versus maybe one of the papers that we wrote throughout the semester where it's here's my argument, I'm going to support my argument for the rest of the essay. But with the research paper of here's this issue that I recognize is a problem that the community faces, but what are the best ways to go about fixing this? I need to figure this out as I go through and start researching, right?
Yeah.
Or what are the best ways to address this? That will come out later on. Any questions at all about putting the intro together? some of the components of the intro or how you would go about adding those things? All right, so let's talk about body paragraphs. So I think that it makes sense to think about your body paragraphs as two sections for this essay. And if you want to, you could totally just like break this essay up into sections. You could have like section 1, introduction, section 2, identifying the community and presenting the problem, section 3, solutions to the problem. Like if you wanted to do that and like literally have headings in your research paper, that's totally fine if it helps you stay organized with it. Or you could just have body paragraphs like, kind of moving right through one another, and that could work well too. So it's totally up to you on whatever helps you feel that you'll stay more organized. And I'll give you examples next week of papers that do both versions of these things. So you want to think about this first part of your research paper's body. These are going to be more like this section here, which is identifying the community and presenting the problem. This is going to be more than just one body paragraph, right? This could be 3 body paragraphs, 4, 2, right? Like, but there needs to be some sort of, in your first body paragraphs, your research project, you're going to be addressing and identifying the community and observed problem in more detail. So this is where you show your reader, here's what the community is, and here's the problem that they're facing. And so you need to convince your reader the severity of this problem and make sure that you're using outside sources throughout these body paragraphs. Almost every paragraph should be supported by research, as this will help your essay build strong ethos and logos, right? The reason we collected research and think about this idea, like the reason that we're collecting this research throughout the paper is to, or before we start writing, is to build the body paragraphs, right? This isn't, here's what my thoughts are on this topic. This is, here's what I learned about this topic as I went through and I did this research. So you want to make sure that all of your body paragraphs aren't coming from a place of personal opinion. They're not coming from a place of personal experience. They're coming from research, right? This isn't your thoughts on this issue. This is, you've done the research on this issue and now here's what you found. So in the same way that you would find research to show here's how to, a solution to this problem, you would also find research to show here is what this problem is, right? So every body paragraph, for the most part, that you're putting together here should have some sort of quote or paraphrase or something establishing, that strength or fortifying that claim that you're making with whatever you found in the outside source. And so kind of think about this idea of like, before you started researching this or as you're researching this, maybe you have no idea, right? Like maybe it's like, if I'm researching homelessness within the Bay Area and I start to say like, well, what is one of the reasons for this problem? I don't know, right? Like I have no idea. It's just something that I see in my community. I'm curious about, I'm interested in, and I don't know what the issue is, right? I don't know what's creating it. I don't know why today we see so much more of it than we did when I was a kid, or maybe it always existed. I have no idea. Maybe it was just, hidden or something like that, right? And so the idea is that because I don't know, I'm not going to just throw in my opinion or my observations because those aren't credible. Those are just guesses, right? Those are just one person's experience. The credibility of your argument comes from, here's what the experts are saying about this, and I'm presenting this idea, right? And your body paragraphs should build on one another, and the relationships between them should be pretty clear to your reader, right? So you should be able to see that, like, maybe if I established it, like, here it is one of the problems this community faces, and then maybe I could say, like, this problem is made worse by, I don't know, another issue, then maybe there's a cause and effect relationship between those paragraphs, and here's why this one comes first, this one comes second.
Yeah, I'd say it's also thinking about saving your best for last, right? Is like, if your problem has something like, here's 2 things with this issue that most people are pretty aware of, and here's this last thing that almost nobody's aware of but contributes to everything else. Like, save that point for last, whatever you think is going to be like the most shocking or most interesting for your reader.
Exactly. And so thinking about that idea too of like, you want to make sure that your reader, like going on Chris's point about like kind of saving that strongest point for last, is like, you want to make sure that you're really kind of hitting them with ideas of like, here is, again, how this community is affected, right, is really important. So it's not just saying like, oh, here's a problem, but then really get to that so what idea.
Mhm.
How is that problem impacting people? Why is that problem worthy of our attention, right? And so kind of think about that same idea, that structure that we talked about this semester. Tell me, show me, so what? What is your claim? What is your evidence to support your claim? And what is your analysis of that claim that you're making? So again, this first section of the body of your essay, identifying the community and presenting the problem, this should be, I imagine in this section here, like a page and a half, 2 pages, something like that, like really making sure that you're like diving into and showing the reader, here's what the issue is, here's how the members of this community are impacted, right? Here is the problem. The next section then will be solutions to the problem, right? These are the remaining body paragraphs of your essay. And again, this is going to be more than one body paragraph to show the solutions to this problem. So each of the solutions should be supported by research, right? So this is important again, right? Thinking about this idea, it's not, here's what I think we should do, right? It's, here's what I think we should do or what should be done based off of the research that I found, based off of this article, based off of this example. So you may have found sources that describe support programs or structures that can be applied to your community or on a larger scale, right? So that's one of those things to think about. I was reading a paper last semester by a student who was exploring homelessness in the Bay Area. And one of the things that he found was, I think it was like somewhere in Connecticut, there was a program that was put in place where it was like people were given, daily pay at a reasonable rate and a place to stay for helping, support the community by doing like cleanup within parks or whatever specific kind of work within their community. And like this student was advocating that he thinks this was a really strong solution because one, it helped the community, like creating this like beautification, program, but that more importantly, it helped people by giving their like day purpose, and it gave them money to be able to go out and, start, have money for food or for whatever kind of spending they needed. And then also a safe and supportive place to stay with, counseling and things like that available. It was a really small example of a program, right? It was some small town, some other state, but they found that article and they liked that so much as a solution that they said, like, this is something that I think is a great solution that could be applied on a larger scale. So if it's something that's not necessarily happening in our community, but you're like, look at what they're doing here, and we should be able to do the same thing in the Bay Area,
Yeah.
right? Or we should be able to do the same thing on a larger scale. So make sure that you're kind of showing the reader the connection between what you've read and what your argument is, and make sure that you're drawing, again, that analysis to explain, here's why this is valuable, here's why this is an important solution, or here's how this could impact the community.
Yeah. I would say even if it's something that's going on like outside the country, if there's an interesting way that they're dealing with homelessness in Italy or in Mexico, like, yeah, totally use that. That can still work really well for your argument.
Exactly. And because it's true to the things that we do now, right? Like, I mean, we have, if we see there's problems or we become inspired by things that people are doing far away or things that people are doing that aren't members of our community, like, oh, I like this. I mean, I see that all the
Yeah.
time with like community colleges, right? I go to statewide trainings, or I talk to people who teach at community colleges across the country, and I'm like, this thing that they're doing in Baltimore is really awesome, and we should be doing the same thing in California, specifically at Solano. Or I, have a friend who works at Irvine Valley College, and I'm like, their English program and the way they support non-native English speakers is really, really strong, and we should try to start doing the same thing at Solano, right? So it's like, you can find examples from places far away from you or small examples and be like, this is what we should be working towards. So people are critical of solutions, right? They can say, oh, they could be too expensive, they could be too hard to implement, they could have drawbacks. So in your solution body paragraphs, there should be a section where you acknowledge counter argument, right? So are the counter arguments valid? Does it make your solution impractical, right? Like, so think about any situation where someone's presenting counter argument. You can either do kind of one of two things. You can fight against the counter argument and explain why that counter argument is not valid, or you could concede that counter argument and be like, yeah, you're right. Right. Like, so if I think about maybe a certain situation, I think about, I don't know, again, going back to that example that we're talking about this morning of homelessness within the Bay Area, and I would say one of the things that we need to do is we need to make sure that we have adequate counseling to be able to help people who are, experiencing homeless right now in California. And someone were to say, that's incredibly expensive. Do you know how expensive that would be to employ all of these different social workers and all of these different counselors and psychologists and things like that? I'd be like, yeah, it is expensive, but it's worth this much money because here's what the possible solution can be, right? So I mean, kind of think about that idea of like, there are going to be those situations where someone could say, like, if I don't know, if I say, oh, well, it's better to eat healthy than it is to eat fast food. Well, it's like, well, yeah, but McDonald's is super cheap. I'm like, true, but here's why it's better to go to a grocery store and eat, whatever vegetables and things like that, than it is to eat a Big Mac, right? So it's like, just because a counter argument is true, doesn't mean that it outweighs the possible solution, right? And so really
Yeah.
kind of think about that situation. Maybe when it comes to your topic, somebody could have a valid criticism. Well, it's expensive to implement, or it's too hard to implement. And you can say, yeah, but that's where we need to put our resources. That's where we need to put our time and energy.
Yeah, it creates, even if a counter argument has a really good point, it's going to create a stronger paper if you admit that counter argument has a good point rather than just
Mhm.
ignoring it, because then you're just leaving
Exactly.
it up to your reader to tear down your argument on their own.
Exactly. Right. It just it makes your ideas more well thought out, and it's also honest,
Yeah.
right? Like, I don't think any situation where there's like kind of a solution is that solution necessarily going to be something that's met with zero resistance, right? Like, whenever we make changes on campus to our English classes or big changes at Solano, you prepare for the concerns that people are going to have with those changes, and then you're ready to address those. And sometimes addressing those is being like, you're right, but here's why this is much more beneficial. Or
Mhm.
someone might have a counter argument that's totally impractical. Someone might have a counter argument that you can very easily destroy, right? They can very easily say, you know what, I don't think that's a valid counter argument. I remember I got in a debate with a neighbor from across the street one night. Like, we were having like, a neighbor invited us over for dinner, and it was a bunch of us that live in my immediate little court, and people were talking, and I was like, somehow the topic of homelessness came up, and I was like making a point about like, yeah, we need to do something to support it. And he was like, who's we? Why should my tax dollars go to this, and why should I have to pay taxes to help other people? And I was like, because you live in a community, and that's what we do as members of community. Is it's a cohesive group of people that are all working together to support each other. That's what the whole idea behind taxes and community living. It's like, that's not a valid counter argument to me, right? I don't have to be like, hey, you're right, that's a valid point, but here's this. It's like, no, the very definition of living in a community is working together towards a greater good. And so, I don't know, I pay taxes all the time. I buy something, I pay taxes on it. I get a paycheck, I pay taxes on it, right? It's like, that's done to work towards infrastructure of things, roads, schools, right? Like, I don't know, I have friends with no kids that pay money into public schools because it comes out of their taxes, but it's part of the greater good, right? And so, just because someone presents a counter argument doesn't mean that you have to think it's a valid one and that you concede that counter argument. You can argue against it and be like, this is here's an article that I found. This is not a logical counter argument. Sometimes you're going to see two opposing viewpoints from similar research. Just because something is research, just because something appears in a peer reviewed journal, doesn't mean that there's only a right way of perceiving something. There's very, very heavy sources of contention or sources of argument within experts within a field. There's not often this situation where everybody agrees and nods their head to the same thing. So just because it's in a peer reviewed journal doesn't mean that you won't find an opposing viewpoint, right? For example, Solano College now has all students have access to be able to take transfer level math and transfer level English. So you can sign up for English 1 your first semester at Solano. In the past, you used to have to sign up for remedial courses, right? Like sometimes 2-3 semesters before English 1. There was a law that was passed that changed that, right? And now students are able to take transfer level English their first semester. I agree with that, right? And I worked hard to be able to talk to legislators and try to make that law become a reality. But within the discipline of English, within the discipline of specifically English within California community colleges, there are articles that you can find that are in support of this law called AB 705. And there are articles that you can find in the same peer-reviewed journals that are against this law called AB 705. There is not a consensus. Even within our own department at Solano, there are some people who are very much so for this change and some people who are very much so against this change. Both viewpoints coming from positions of expertise, but just because experts have an opinion on it doesn't mean that that opinion is an agreeing one. So the reason I'm telling you this is to think about, you might find counter argument from an expert and then be able to rebuttal that counter argument with another expert. So 2 sources could be arguing a different opposing viewpoint on something. For example, in New York, they have right to shelter laws, right? So when it comes to homelessness in the city of New York, right? I think actually across the whole state, but I know specifically within New York City, there are apartments, hotels, things like that that are open up. People are just given the right to shelter, right? That if you need a place to sleep, there is supposed to be a citywide guarantee that there's a place for you to sleep. Some people, experts within the field of homelessness, would argue that that is not a great program because within these different places where these right to shelters are given, there's an increased amount of violence, there's an increased amount of drug use, right? That like, just because somebody has shelter doesn't mean that you're protecting them. And there's some really compelling, and a student found 2 articles on that same topic fighting against each other that was presenting both really strong arguments on one side and the other side. And then they were able to say, here's what I think, right? Based off of these 2. So you might find counter argument from 2 different peer reviewed sources. And again, when you're thinking about these body paragraphs, these ideas should be building on each other, right? Like think about the order, kind of Chris's point, what is the strongest idea? And I would say whatever you think the strongest solution, that's where you should end your solutions to the problem body paragraphs, right? That should be your last one. Any questions at all on the body of this essay, either in identifying the community you're presenting the problem or the solutions to the problem?
I would ask, if we do end up in a situation where we're talking about like multiple possible solutions, do we have to introduce all of those in our thesis, or can we give like some overview?
In the thesis, I think definitely overview would work well.
Yeah.
Right. Because remember, you don't want to give away everything in your thesis statement. You don't want the reader to feel like, oh, why do I need to read this essay? Just like looking at a movie trailer. Well, why do I need to see this movie now? You already gave the whole movie away, right? So you want to like overview generally like, here's the problems and whether it's, addressing it this way or finding a way to fix it that way. That's kind of what you're exploring about what the best way is to fix this, right? So it's like you're really making sure that you're giving the reader the opportunity to figure this out as they're reading through your essay. So another question, how many body paragraphs could we have? So as far as minimum, I imagine that it'll probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6 body paragraphs, right? Something like that, right? Maybe like, this isn't a hard for sure number, but I imagine like maybe 2 to 4 for this identifying the community and presenting the problem, and like maybe like 2 to 4 for this solutions to the problem. So really, like, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6 to 8 body paragraphs. And then your conclusion, right? And your conclusion will be, your conclusion for this project should be identifying the best possible solution to the problem that you've identified, right? So, and now that you've broken down the different solutions, your conclusion is like, here is the best one. Here is what I think should be done, right? From the research that you've done, here's what you're concluding. Here's a solution that you found. Here's the issue. Here's what can be done to address it. So then questions to think about to help you develop this idea out. Is the solution practical? You know, maybe one of the things to think about is like, how practical is a solution? How much infrastructure will the solution take? Sometimes solutions can be fairly easy, like kind of, you know, flipping a switch, and then things have to be, you know, things can change, right? Pretty quick and easy with like, oh, this is kind of a no-brainer, easy fix. Sometimes solutions are very complex. It takes more than, you know, just one group doing something. Maybe it's a whole kind of like mindset change for people, right? So kind of really think about like, how practical is it? How can this solution be implemented, right? So maybe it can be implemented by, I don't know, members of the community working together. Maybe it's specifically the government who has to implement it. Maybe a law has to be passed, right? So kind of think about like, what is a way to think about how this solution can be implemented. Next, I want you to think about how will this solution affect the community? Not necessarily even members of the community who are experiencing it, but maybe other members of the community. Sometimes, I don't know, if I think about homelessness in the Bay Area, I'm not somebody who's experiencing homelessness, but I could say that maybe if I think about from a persuasive standpoint, I could say like, maybe the whole Bay Area could be better off. Maybe people in the community could feel like, you know, not only are people most importantly being supported who are homeless, but maybe that other people in the community are benefiting because, I don't know, there's changes that are happening around their neighborhoods, whatever the case is. So how will the community be affected? And then finally, what will this community who's experiencing this problem look like after the solution is carried out? Kind of what is like this almost like perfect world result of this solution being carried out? Maybe this solution is something that takes time, right? Maybe it's not something that's like this very perfect light switch is flipped on and now everything's okay, but maybe we're headed in the right direction. Maybe you start to show like, hey, this will take a while. This won't be something that's an overnight fix, but maybe through a shift in culture, maybe through a shift in ideas, maybe we start to see the quality of life improve for people, that can be the direction that you want to think about of like, once this best solution is carried out, what do things look like from then on, right? And that's kind of what you're doing for your conclusion. Almost like that we talked about, the idea of conclusion, like that final sense of analysis, that final takeaway there. Yeah, so your solution should be addressing, that's a good question, Tia, about like, should your solution or your conclusion be addressing the solutions we've already talked about excuse me, in the paragraphs before? Yes. So it'll be whatever paragraph, whatever solution, and maybe it's a combination of them to kind of maybe there's not one, the best, but maybe it's like, this can't happen without that, right? Like these two things have to work together. So maybe one of the things you think about is like, yeah, you're still addressing the same thing, but now you're really jumping into what does this community look like after this conclusion is carried out? Why is it so important, or why is it so vital that we carry out this solution or a combination of these solutions, right? Because you might find that like one solution is not enough, right? That it's not enough to just say like, you know, like for example, you know, when I was reading students' research papers, I learned a lot of students have written about homelessness in the Bay Area, and I've learned a lot about it. And the solution that makes a lot of sense to me is two things happening at the same time. One, like a student wrote about how in the city of San Diego, it's illegal for people to sleep on the street, and that they passed a law making that the case. That's one part of the solution. But that would be terrible if there was just a law saying, hey, you're not allowed to sleep on the street, but if you don't have any place to go, sorry, you broke the law. The second part of that solution, and the most important part of that solution, is creating an infrastructure of supportive places with counseling and social workers and shelter for people. So if they are sleeping on the street and in fact breaking that newly enacted law, here is a place where they're able to go, where they're going to be able to receive, you know, as much of a quality of support that they can to be able to try to remedy that situation, right? And so like those two things can't exist without each other, right? That there needs to be kind of a double-sided attack on this issue and a double-sided solution. So it might be one thing, it might be a couple things working together.
I would also say in the conclusion is where you can start bringing back in your own opinion and your own thoughts about this issue. Like for the most part, you're letting the research do the talking, but for this part, if you really think like this is the most important part of the solution, put your emphasis there. Of like if you've already done the research and like shown all the pieces and everything, if you're coming to the conclusion that like of the solutions I've looked at, I think this part is most important and maybe these things are secondary, talk about it that way.
Yeah, this is just your, like, just like any other conclusion essay, it's like your final bit of time that you have with your reader. So you want to make sure that you're kind of giving that final analysis and what is the idea that you want your reader to take away after having read your paper. Any other questions about the structure of this thing? Okay, so for this week then, what we're working on is like finishing up that second source report. But I think it's a good idea to start like putting together like a rough outline for yourself, right? Like, here's the ideas that I want to talk about in my intro. Here's some of the points I'm going to be making in my body paragraphs, identifying the community particular problem, solutions to the problem. And then how many paragraphs should you have? Just like I kind of mentioned before, like it's not 100% set thing, but I imagine an intro paragraph and a concluding paragraph, right? And these are going to be longer, well-developed paragraphs. We got a lot to do. And then I would say probably like somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6 or so body paragraphs, right? Maybe a few for 2 to 4 for identifying the community and presenting the problem, and maybe 2 to 4 for solutions to the problem. So I was somewhere in the neighborhood of about like 8 to 10 paragraphs total for this essay. Any other questions? All right, so if you have any questions at all when you're working this week, if you want us to look at sources with you, or you want to talk about how you might structure your research paper, just let us know. I'll be around for office hours today, but I'll also be available throughout the week. And then next week, we'll look at some sample research papers that I'll post. This research paper is going to be due the week of finals, which is, I think finals start the 11th, I'm pretty sure. Let me double check, but I think it's like that Friday. Yeah, so finals week, I think, goes into the week of December 13th. So once I'll have it due during that week, and I'll post next week the exact day that this research paper will be due.
Yeah.
So this is what we're working on from here on out, right? It's just building these ideas and putting this research paper together.
And same goes for me. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, or if you want to set up a Zoom meeting, happy to do that.
And then the research paper is your final. You won't have another final. This is the final thing you're turning in this semester. So there's not going to be anything else that you do beyond this. And the intention is that you're kind of putting like your time and your energy and all your eggs into that basket. And the other thing is, what I'll encourage you to do is, and I'll post about this next week, I'll open up the research paper for you to turn in. It'll have the specific due date, but I'll have it available so you can turn it in before finals week if you want to. And that'll be really helpful in case you have like cumulative finals that you're studying for, things like that. It'll give you the opportunity to have this turned in a little bit early if you need that additional time to study for some finals that you're working on. So right now, like getting ahead of the game on the research paper is beneficial, not just for this class, but maybe for other classes also, because that could free up some time where it's like, okay, I'm done with my English 1 class, I've turned in my research paper, and now I can, spend this additional time that I have working on studying for a final for another class. All right, so just like I said, let us know if you have any questions when you're working. We'll be available. Shoot me an email, hang out, talk to me during office hours if you have any questions, and then we can start, looking at the structure of your papers, see if you need that, or looking for sources or anything like that if you have any questions.